Hi, my name's Maya, and when I was 15, my parents told me they couldn't afford to keep me anymore and dropped me at a group home. Said it was temporary. 8 years later, they showed up at my apartment with lawyers and smiles, claiming I was heir to a $1 billion fortune. They'd never mentioned I was adopted. Now tell me, what would you do if the people who threw you away came back when they discovered you were worth more than they ever imagined? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The rain hammered against the windows of our cramped apartment in East Cleveland that October night. I was curled up on the couch doing algebra homework, the kind that makes your brain feel like it's melting, when I heard them arguing in the kitchen again. Mom's voice was sharp, cutting through the thin walls like broken glass. Dad's responses came in low, tired mumbles that I couldn't quite make out. I tried to focus on the equations in front of me, but their voices kept bleeding through. Something about bills, about choices, about things being different if they'd never taken me in. That last part made my stomach twist in a way I didn't understand yet. The arguing stopped suddenly, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than the noise. I heard footsteps, deliberate and careful, moving toward the living room. Mom appeared in the doorway first, her auburn hair pulled back too tight, making her face look severe. Dad followed, running his hands through what was left of his graying hair. They both looked at me like I was a problem they'd been trying to solve for years. "Maya, we need to talk," Mom said, settling into the worn armchair across from me. Her voice had that fake gentleness people use when they're about to ruin your life. I closed my textbook slowly, that familiar knot forming in my chest, the same knot that appeared whenever they looked at me like that, like I was an unwelcome guest who'd overstayed her welcome. "We've been thinking," Dad started, then stopped, glancing at Mom for support. "Things have been hard lately. Really hard." I nodded because I knew. I'd seen the stack of overdue bills on the kitchen counter, heard the phone calls from creditors, watched them count and recount the money in Mom's purse at the grocery store. "We think it might be better," Mom continued, her words measured and careful, "if you stayed somewhere else for a while. Just until we get back on our feet." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean, somewhere else?" "There's a place," Dad said. "Quickly. A group home. Nice people. They'll take good care of you." Group home. The words hit me like ice water. I'd heard about those places at school, whispered about in hallways by kids whose parents had given up on them, kids who got shuffled from house to house like unwanted furniture. "For how long?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "Just temporarily," Mom said, but she wouldn't look me in the eye. "Until we figure things out." I stared at them both, searching their faces for some sign that this was a joke, a test, anything but what it sounded like. But Dad's shoulders were slumped with defeat, and Mom's mouth was set in that hard line she got when she'd made up her mind about something. "When?" I whispered. "Tomorrow," Dad said. "We've already called them. They're expecting you." Tomorrow. Not next week, not next month. Tomorrow. Like I was a problem that needed to be solved immediately. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand an explanation that made sense. Instead, I just sat there, feeling something inside me break quietly. The same something that had been cracking for months every time they looked at me like I was a burden, every time they whispered about money troubles and stopped when I walked into the room. "We'll visit," Mom said, reaching over to touch my hand. Her fingers were cold. "As soon as we can." I pulled my hand away. "Why can't I get a job? Help with money? I'm old enough to work part-time." "It's not that simple," Dad said, but he didn't explain what made it complicated. "Is it because I'm not really your daughter?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I hadn't planned to ask it, but lately I'd been noticing things. How I looked nothing like either of them. How neighbors sometimes asked if I was visiting. How they never talked about when I was born or showed me baby pictures. Mom's face went white. Dad's jaw tightened. "Where did you get that idea?" Mom asked, her voice strained. I don't look like you. And you never talk about when I was little." They exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations that parents have over their children's heads. "You're our daughter in every way that matters," Dad said finally. "But yes, you were adopted, when you were 3. The word adopted hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The lack of baby photos, the way they sometimes seemed surprised by my interests, how I'd always felt like I was playing a role in someone else's family. "Who were my real parents?" I asked. "That doesn't matter now," Mom said quickly. "What matters is that we love you, and this is just temporary." But I could see it in their eyes. The relief that they'd finally said it out loud. The guilt that came with abandoning someone they'd promised to protect. And underneath it all, something that looked almost like fear. That night, I packed my life into 2 garbage bags and a backpack. Clothes, books, the few photos I had of us together, and a small jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. The only thing they'd told me was from my before life. I held it for a long time, running my fingers over the intricate silver, roses carved into its surface. The next morning came too fast and too slow at the same time. Dad loaded my bags into the back of their old Honda, while Mom stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the October chill. Neither of them cried. Neither did I. The drive to Sunrise Group home took 23 minutes. I counted every one of them, watching familiar neighborhoods give way to unfamiliar ones, feeling like I was being erased with every mile. The house was bigger than I'd expected, a sprawling Victorian painted yellow with white trim. It looked cheerful enough from the outside, but there was something institutional about it, something that screamed temporary in every carefully maintained detail. Mrs. Rodriguez, the director, met us at the door. She was a kind-faced woman, in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many kids like me. She shook my parents' hands and thanked them for calling ahead, like they were doing everyone a favor. "Maya's room is upstairs," she told them. "Second door on the right. She'll be sharing with another girl her age." Mom hugged me goodbye, her arms feeling unfamiliar around my shoulders. "We'll call," she whispered, "as soon as things get better." Dad squeezed my hand and muttered something about this being for the best. Then they were gone, and I was standing in the foyer of a house that smelled like industrial cleaners and other people's sadness, holding 2 garbage bags and wondering, how temporary was temporary? Mrs. Rodriguez showed me to my room, where a girl with short black hair and multiple ear piercings was sitting on one of the twin beds, reading a book about motorcycle repair. "This is Zoe," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Zoe, meet Maya." Zoe looked up and gave me a sardonic smile. "Let me guess. Parents said it was temporary?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "They all say that," she said, going back to her book. "Mine said 6 months. That was 2 years ago." Mrs. Rodriguez left us alone, and I sat on the empty bed staring at my garbage bags. Everything I owned, everything I was, reduced to this. "First piece of advice," Zoe said without looking up. "Stop waiting for them to come back. Makes it easier." But I couldn't stop waiting. Not yet. The first week at Sunrise Group home felt like living underwater. Everything was muffled, distant, like I was watching someone else's life through thick glass. I went through the motions of existing. Wake up at 7 when Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on doors. Shower with industrial soap that smelled like hospitals. Eat breakfast with 12 other kids who all had variations of the same hollow look in their eyes. Zoe had been right about one thing. Most of us were waiting for parents who weren't coming back. The routine was strict, but not unkind. Chores in the morning, school during the day, homework time after dinner, lights out by 10. Mrs. Rodriguez ran the house with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that structure was the only thing standing between these kids and complete chaos. I called my parents every night for the first 3 days. Dad would answer, his voice careful and distant, and assure me they were working on things. Mom would take the phone and ask about school, about whether I was eating enough, about anything except when I could come home. By the 4th day, the calls went straight to voicemail. By the end of the first week, I stopped calling altogether. Smart. Girl, Zoe said one evening as we sat on our beds doing homework. She was working on an essay about the Revolutionary War while I struggled through chemistry problems. Took me way longer to figure that out. Maybe they're just busy, I said, but even I didn't believe it anymore. Zoe snorted. Yeah, busy pretending they never had a kid named Maya. Her words stung because they felt true. In the space of 7 days, I'd gone from being someone's daughter to being nobody at all. Just another case file in Mrs. Rodriguez's office, another mouth to feed at the dinner table. School was its own kind of torture. Westfield High was a sprawling concrete maze where I knew exactly 3 people, none of whom seemed particularly interested in the fact that I'd suddenly become homeless. I'd always been quiet, the kind of student who did her work and didn't cause trouble, but now I felt invisible in a way that made my chest ache. During lunch, I sat alone in the library, pretending to read while actually listening to the conversations happening around me. Normal. Kids talking about normal problems. Who was dating whom? Who got grounded for missing curfew? Who was fighting with their parents about college applications? Parent problems. The luxury of having people who cared enough to fight with you. 2 weeks into my stay at Sunrise, I discovered that being abandoned creates a very specific kind of anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly, but something colder and more persistent. Something that settles into your bones and changes how you see everything. I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. How Mrs. Rodriguez's smile never quite reached her eyes when she talked to us. How the other kids had learned to hoard things in their rooms, small treasures hidden under mattresses and in dresser drawers. How everyone here existed in a state of perpetual temporariness, like we were all waiting for our real lives to begin. Marcus was 17 and had been at Sunrise for 3 years. His parents had died in a car accident, and no relatives wanted to take him in. He was counting down days until he turned 18 and could age out of the system. Lily was 14 and had been removed from her home by social services. She didn't talk about why, but she flinched whenever adults raised their voices. David was 16 and had been abandoned at a fire station when he was 12. His parents had left a note saying they couldn't handle him anymore. Each story was different, but they all ended the same way. Kids learning to survive without the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. 3 weeks in, I started having the dreams. Always the same one. I was standing in our old apartment, calling for Mom and Dad, but the rooms were empty. Their clothes were gone from the closets, their photos removed from the walls, like they'd never existed at all. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat, and for just a moment, I'd forget where I was. Then I'd see Zoe's bed across the room and remember. This was my life now. The school guidance counselor, Ms. Patterson, called me into her office in early November. She was a well-meaning woman in her 30s who wore cardigans and kept a bowl of hard candy on her desk. The kind of person who wanted to help but didn't quite know how. "How are you adjusting?" she asked, offering me a piece of butterscotch candy. I shrugged. "Fine, I guess. That's a pretty big change, moving to a group home. It's normal to feel angry or confused." I picked at the edge of my sleeve. "I'm not angry," but that was a lie. I was furious. Furious at my parents for giving up on me. Furious at myself for not being worth keeping. Furious at the world for being the kind of place where parents could just decide they didn't want their children anymore. Have you heard from your parents? Ms. Patterson asked gently. No. Sometimes adults make decisions that are hard for us to understand. That doesn't mean they don't love you. I looked at her across the desk. This woman who probably went home every night to a house where people were happy to see her, where dinner conversations didn't revolve around how to pay bills or whether there was enough money for groceries. If they loved me, I said quietly, they wouldn't have thrown me away. Ms. Patterson's face softened. Maya, you weren't thrown away. Sometimes families go through difficult times. Then why haven't they called? Why haven't they visited? Why won't they tell me when I can come home? She didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. November turned into December, and the group home prepared for the holidays with the kind of forced cheer that made everything feel sadder. Mrs. Rodriguez put up a Christmas tree in the main room and hung stockings with our names on them. Local churches donated presents, wrapped in shiny paper and labeled by age and gender rather than name. I watched the other kids go through the motions of Christmas morning, opening gifts from strangers, smiling and saying thank you because that's what you did. Even Zoe, who claimed not to care about anything, clutched a new leather jacket like it was made of gold. I got books, practical clothes, and a journal with my initials embossed on the cover. Nice gifts from nice people who wanted to help kids like me. But they weren't from the people I wanted them to be from. That night, I wrote my first entry in the journal. Day 67 at sunrise. Still waiting for temporary to end. Starting to think, it won't. The holidays passed in a blur of group activities and forced joy. New Year's Eve came and went with sparkling cider and a movie marathon that ended at 11 because even group home kids had bedtimes. January brought a new semester and the slow realization that my parents weren't coming back. Not next week, not next month, probably not ever. I'd been abandoned not just physically, but emotionally, cut loose from the only family I'd ever known. That's when something shifted inside me. The desperate hope that had been keeping me awake at night finally died, and in its place grew something harder. Determination, maybe. Or just the simple will to survive. I started focusing on school with an intensity that surprised my teachers. If I was going to be on my own, I needed to be ready for it. I threw myself into every assignment, every test, every project like my life depended on it. Because maybe it did. By February, I'd brought my GPA up to 3.8. By March, I was tutoring other kids in chemistry and algebra. By April, I was looking at college brochures and scholarship applications. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed the change. You're doing really well, Maya. Your teachers are impressed. I have to, I said simply. No one's putting pressure on you. I looked at her, this woman who'd seen dozens of kids like me come and go, who'd watched them age out of the system and disappear into uncertain futures. My parents put pressure on me the day they decided I was disposable, I said. Now I have to prove they were wrong. Spring arrived at Sunrise Group Home like a reluctant visitor, bringing with it the kind of restless energy that made everyone want to be somewhere else. The other kids talked constantly about aging out, about getting apartments, about freedom that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I listened to their plans while working on my own, filling out college applications in the evenings when the house finally quieted down. That's when I met Sergeant First Class Rodriguez. Not Mrs. Rodriguez from the group home, but her nephew, Danny, who'd just returned from his second deployment in Afghanistan. He was 28, built like a brick wall, and had the kind of steady presence that made you feel safer just being in the same room with him. He started volunteering at Sunrise in March, running a mentorship program for older kids who were preparing to transition out of the system. Danny didn't talk much about his military service, but you could see it in the way he carried himself, the way he listened when you spoke, the way he never made promises he couldn't keep. You planning on college? He asked during one of our group sessions. We were sitting in the common room, a circle of mismatched chairs and teenagers who'd learned not to trust adults too quickly. I nodded, clutching the folder of scholarship applications I'd been working on. Full ride to Ohio State, hopefully. Pre-med. That's ambitious. Good for you. He didn't sound surprised or patronizing, just matter of fact. Like believing in my future was the most natural thing in the world. My parents always said college was too expensive, I found myself saying. Guess it doesn't matter what they think anymore. Danny's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. You know what I learned in the army? He said. Sometimes the people who give up on you do you a favor. They get out of the way so you can become who you're really supposed to be. Those words stuck with me long after the session ended. I'd been thinking of my abandonment as something that had been done to me, something I had to overcome. But what if it was actually something that had freed me? Over the next few weeks, Danny and I started talking more. He'd find me in the library during his visits, usually hunched over textbooks or scholarship essays. He never pushed for conversation, just sat nearby working on his own stuff, occasionally offering help with applications or sharing stories about military life that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with finding family in unexpected places. You ever think about the military? He asked one evening in late April. I was struggling with a particularly brutal physics problem, and he'd been helping me work through the math. I shook my head. I want to be a doctor. Save lives, not take them. Military doctors save lives too. Some of the best medics I knew started out wanting to help people. He paused, considering his words carefully. There are programs, ways to get your education paid for while serving. Just something to think about. I looked at him across the table. This man who'd somehow become the closest thing to a father figure I'd had since Dad gave up on me. Is that what you'd do? If you were me? I'd do whatever gave me the most options, he said. The military taught me that you can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. By May, I'd been accepted to 3 universities with partial scholarships. Good news, but not good enough. Even with financial aid, I'd still need loans, work-study programs, and probably a part-time job to make it work. The gap between my dreams and my bank account felt insurmountable. That's when Danny suggested I talk to his friend Captain Martinez, a recruiter who specialized in working with kids from difficult backgrounds. She came to Sunrise one evening, a small woman with kind eyes and a uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass. The Army's Health Professions Scholarship Program, she explained, spreading brochures across the common room table. Full tuition, books, lab fees, plus a monthly stipend. In exchange, you serve as a military doctor for a certain number of years after you graduate. I stared at the papers, my heart beating fast. It's really free? It's earned, she corrected gently. You'd be an officer, a leader. The Army would invest in your education because they believe you have something valuable to offer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to Zoe's steady breathing, thinking about futures I'd never considered. The military had always seemed like something other people did, people who were tougher or more desperate than me. But maybe desperation was exactly what I needed. I started researching everything I could find about military medicine, reading testimonials from doctors who'd served, learning about field hospitals and combat medics and the kind of work that happened when saving lives was literally a matter of life and death. The more I read, the more it felt like something I could see myself doing. Not because I wanted to be in the military necessarily, but because I wanted to be the kind of person who could handle anything. The kind of person who couldn't be abandoned because she was too valuable, too strong, too necessary. 3 days before my 18th birthday, I made my decision. Captain Martinez came back to Sunrise, this time with paperwork and a timeline. If I enlisted in the Army Reserve while finishing high school, I could start basic training the summer after graduation. The scholarship would kick in when I started college in the fall, assuming I met all the requirements. It's a big commitment. She warned me. 8 years total. 4 years of college, 4 years of active duty after you graduate medical school. 8 years felt like a lifetime, but it also felt like security. Like having a plan that nobody could take away from me. I signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon in Mrs. Rodriguez's office, using a pen that had probably signed 100 similar documents for 100 other kids who'd learned that sometimes the only person you can count on is yourself. Mrs. Rodriguez watched me initial each page with something that might have been pride. Your parents know about this? I looked up at her. This woman who'd housed and fed me for 8 months without ever making me feel like a burden. My parents gave up the right to know about my decisions when they dropped me off here. She nodded slowly. You're probably right about that. That evening, I called Danny to tell him the news. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting. I enlisted, I said without preamble. How do you feel about it? I considered the question, sitting on my bed with Zoe pretending not to listen from across the room. Like I'm finally moving forward instead of just waiting for something to happen. That's the right answer, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. For the first time since that October night when my parents told me I was too expensive to keep, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. High school graduation came on a humid June morning that felt more like an ending than a beginning. I sat in the second row of folding chairs on the football field, wearing a cap and gown that smelled like mothballs and other people's dreams. Around me, my classmates fidgeted with their tassels while their families filled the bleachers with cameras and proud tears. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the family section, wearing a navy dress she'd probably bought specifically for this occasion. Danny was there too, crisp in his dress uniform, the ribbons on his chest catching the morning sunlight. They were the only people in those bleachers who'd come for me. I'd stopped expecting my parents months ago, but their absence still felt like a hollow space in my chest. 18 years old, graduating third in my class, headed to Ohio State on a full military scholarship, and the people who'd raised me couldn't be bothered to show up. After the ceremony, Mrs. Rodriguez hugged me tight and pressed a small wrapped box into my hands. For your new beginning, she said. Inside was a silver necklace with a small compass pendant. So you always know which direction you're heading, she explained. Danny clapped me on the shoulder like I was one of his soldiers. Basic training starts in 6 weeks. You ready for this? I touched the compass at my throat. Ready as I'll ever be. Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri was a special kind of hell designed to break down everything you thought you knew about yourself and rebuild it from scratch. The drill sergeant screamed. The Missouri heat was unforgiving, and every day felt like a test I wasn't sure I could pass. But I'd been preparing for this without knowing it. Years of living in uncertainty, of not knowing if I had a place to belong, had made me adaptable in ways my fellow recruits couldn't understand. When they cried for their mothers during the first week, I was already asleep. When they complained about the food, I remembered going hungry. When they talked about quitting, I thought about having nowhere to quit to. Private Jackson, my bunkmate, was a 19-year-old from suburban Atlanta whose parents had driven him to the recruiting station in their BMW. She'd enlisted to pay for law school and spent most of our first week asking when we could call home. Don't you miss your family? She asked one night after lights out, her voice small in the darkness of our barracks. Can't miss what you never really had, I whispered. Back. She was quiet for a long moment. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Maybe it was sad, or maybe it was just practical. I'd learned that expecting nothing meant never being disappointed. The physical training was brutal but straightforward. Run faster, climb higher, carry more weight. My body adapted the way bodies do when they have no choice. The mental challenges were harder. Learning to follow orders without question, to trust people I barely knew, to become part of something larger than myself. Drill Sergeant Morrison was a 30-year veteran with shoulders like a linebacker and a voice that could strip paint. He singled me out during the third week, not for punishment, but for something else entirely. "Chen," he barked after morning PT. "You're always alone. Why's that?" I stood at attention, staring straight ahead. "No reason, Drill Sergeant." "That's bullshit, soldier. Everyone's got a reason." He circled me like a predator sizing up prey. "You think you're better than the others?" "No, Drill Sergeant." "You think you don't need anybody?" That question hit closer to home. "I think I can't count on anybody, Drill Sergeant." He stopped in front of me, studying my face with eyes that had seen too much. "Wrong answer, Chen. In the Army, you count on everybody, and everybody counts on you. That's how we stay alive." He assigned me to squad leader duties that week, forcing me to work with the other recruits instead of staying on the periphery. Jackson became my responsibility, along with 3 other soldiers who were struggling with different aspects of training. Teaching them forced me to learn something I'd been avoiding, that sometimes taking care of other people was the same as taking care of yourself. That leadership wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest, but about making sure everyone made it through together. By the end of basic training, I'd earned the respect of my fellow soldiers and something I'd never had before, a sense of belonging that wasn't conditional on being perfect or convenient. The graduation ceremony was smaller than high school, just our families and some officers, who'd come to watch another crop of civilians become soldiers. Mrs. Rodriguez had driven down from Ohio, and Danny was there in uniform again, standing a little straighter when I received my promotion to private first class. "How does it feel?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked afterward as we walked across the parade ground. "Like I finally know who I am," I said, and realized I meant it. College started 3 weeks later. Ohio State was massive, overwhelming, a sprawling campus where I could disappear entirely if I wanted to. But I didn't want to disappear anymore. I wanted to excel. My pre-med classes were challenging in a way that felt familiar now. Organic chemistry, anatomy, physics, biology labs that lasted until midnight. While my classmates complained about the workload, I thought about battlefield medicine and combat surgeons who had to make life or death decisions with limited resources. The military scholarship meant I attended reserve drills 1 weekend a month, keeping my soldier skills sharp while focusing on my civilian education. My unit was mostly older soldiers, men and women who'd served multiple deployments and treated me like a little sister who needed protecting. Sergeant Williams, AI, medic who'd served 3 tours in Iraq, became my unofficial mentor. "You planning on being a combat medic?" he asked during one drill weekend. "Eventually, after medical school." He nodded approvingly. "Good. We need more doctors who understand what it's like downrange. Too many of them think war is what they see in movies." I shared an apartment near campus with 2 other pre-med students, Emma and Sarah, who came from the kind of families that paid for college without thinking twice about it. They were good people, but they lived in a world I'd never inhabited, where parents called to check on grades and sent care packages filled with homemade cookies. They tried to include me in their family gatherings, but I always found excuses. Thanksgiving break, Christmas vacation, spring break trips to Florida. I spent those times working extra shifts at the campus medical center, learning to draw blood and take vitals and comfort people who were scared and hurting. The work felt like coming home. Junior year at Ohio State brought a rhythm I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely settled. My grades were solid, my military service was going well, and I'd even started dating someone. Kevin was a fellow pre-med student from Toledo, the kind of steady, dependable person who brought me coffee during study sessions and never asked too many questions about my past. My apartment had become a real home, not just a place to sleep between classes. Emma and Sarah had graduated, but I'd found new roommates who were equally focused on their studies. The walls were covered with anatomy posters and class schedules, and my desk was permanently buried under textbooks and lab reports. I'd established. Routines that felt normal, even boring in the best possible way. Morning runs around campus, afternoon classes, evening study sessions at the medical library, weekend drills with my reserve unit, where I'd been promoted to specialist and was training to become a medic, Sunday dinners with Kevin and his friends, where I slowly learned how to be part of a group without waiting for them to decide I was too much trouble. The nightmares about my parents had mostly stopped. When I thought about them at all, it was with a kind of detached curiosity, like wondering about characters from a book I'd read long ago. They'd become part of my origin story, the reason I was strong and self-reliant, but not the driving force of my daily life anymore. Dr. Hendricks, my organic chemistry professor, called me into her office in late September. She was a small woman, with gray hair and the kind of intense focus that made students either love her or transfer to easier classes. "Your MCAT scores came back," she said, sliding an envelope across her desk. I opened it with steady hands, scanning the numbers that would determine whether medical school was a realistic goal or just an expensive fantasy. The score was higher than I'd hoped, high enough for admission to competitive programs. "Congratulations," Dr. Hendricks said, smiling for the first time since I'd known her. "With scores like these and your military service, you'll have your pick of schools." That evening, I called Mrs. Rodriguez to share the news. She'd become my unofficial family, the person I called with both good news and bad. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did. "Maya, how are you, sweetheart?" "I got my MCAT scores back, 5 or 17. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard what sounded like crying. "Mrs. Rodriguez? Are you okay?" "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Wendell would be so proud too. Wendell was her husband, who'd died 2 years earlier. He'd been a maintenance worker at the group home, a quiet man who fixed broken things without being asked and never forgot anyone's birthday. He'd been kind to me during my time at Sunrise, the type of steady presence that made difficult days easier. "He always said you were going to be something special," she continued. "Said you had steel in your spine that most people never develop." I felt tears threatening, the good kind that came with feeling truly seen and valued. "Thank you for everything." "You don't need to thank me, honey. You did this yourself." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment thinking about the strange family I'd assembled over the years. Mrs. Rodriguez, Danny, Sergeant Williams, even Dr. Hendricks in her own way. People who'd chosen to invest in me without expecting anything in return. It was different from the family I'd been born into, but maybe it was better because it was based on choice rather than obligation. Kevin knocked on my door around 8, carrying Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine he'd probably bought to celebrate my scores. "So," he said, settling beside me on the couch, "where are you thinking for medical school?" I'd been researching programs for months, but now that the scores were real, the decision felt more urgent. "Probably stay in state. Case Western has a good program, and the military scholarship covers everything." "What about after? Where do you want to practice?" It was a question I'd been avoiding because the answer felt too ambitious to say out loud. Military medicine, eventually. Combat medic first, then maybe trauma surgery. I want to work in places where it really matters. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Kevin nodded, but I could see him calculating the implications. Military medicine meant deployments, long separations, a life built around service rather than stability. It wasn't the kind of future most people planned for together. "That's really admirable," he said, and I could tell he meant it. Scary, but admirable. We didn't break up that night, but something shifted between us. The recognition that we were heading toward different kinds of lives, that what worked for us now might not work forever. October brought the start of medical school application season, A months-long process of essays and interviews and waiting. I threw myself into it with the same intensity I'd applied to everything else, crafting personal statements about service and purpose while my classmates wrote about family legacies and childhood dreams of helping people. My essay began with a line that felt true in a way I'd never been able to articulate before. I learned to take care of others by first learning to take care of myself. The interviews started in November. Case Western, Ohio State, University of Cincinnati, even a reach application to Johns Hopkins that I'd submitted mostly to prove I could. Each interview followed a similar pattern. Questions about my motivation, my military service, my plans for the future. You've overcome significant challenges, the interviewer at Case Western observed, reviewing my file. How do you think that experience will make you a better doctor? I think it's taught me that people are stronger than they know, I said, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is believe they can handle the truth. By December, I'd completed 6 interviews and was waiting for responses. The uncertainty was familiar but different now, because I knew that regardless of which school accepted me, I was moving toward a future I'd chosen rather than one that had been chosen for me. Kevin and I ended things amicably during finals week, both of us acknowledging that we wanted different things from life. It was my first relationship that ended because of growth rather than abandonment, and somehow that felt like progress. I spent New Year's Eve alone in my apartment, not because I didn't have options, but because I wanted to mark the transition quietly. At midnight, I raised a glass of cheap champagne to my empty living room and toasted the woman I was becoming. Someone who could be alone without being lonely, who could build a life from nothing, who could choose service over safety and call it home. The acceptance letter from Case Western arrived on a Tuesday in February, thick and heavy with promise. Medical school at Case Western consumed me in the best possible way. The workload was crushing, the competition fierce, and the material more complex than anything I'd encountered before. While my classmates struggled with the transition from undergraduate handholding to medical school independence, I thrived in the environment that demanded everything and gave little comfort in return. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation despite sharing my last name, became my anatomy professor and unofficial mentor. She was a former military surgeon who'd served in Kosovo and Afghanistan before transitioning to academic medicine. During our first lab session, she noticed the way I handled the cadaver with respect but without squeamishness. "You've seen death before?" she observed after class. "Not like this," I said, thinking of Wendell from the group home, the only funeral I'd ever attended. "But I've learned not to be afraid of difficult things." She nodded approvingly. "Good. Fear makes bad doctors." My military training continued alongside medical school. Weekend drills became more sophisticated as I progressed through combat medic certification. Sergeant Williams pushed me harder than the other soldiers, expecting excellence rather than mere competence. "Chen, you're going to be an officer someday," he said during a particularly brutal field exercise. "That means when everything goes to hell, people are going to look to you for answers. You better have them." The exercises became more realistic, more intense. Simulated battlefield conditions with fake blood and real pressure, learning to make life or death decisions in seconds while bullets flew overhead. Even though the bullets were blanks and the wounds were makeup, my heart raced every time. I discovered I was good at it. More than good. I had steady hands under pressure and the ability to compartmentalize emotion when lives were at stake. During one particularly complex scenario involving multiple casualties, I successfully triaged 5 wounded soldiers and saved 3 lives according to the evaluation criteria. "Natural-born combat medic," Williams told me afterward. "You've got ice water in your veins when it matters." My civilian classmates found my military obligations fascinating but foreign. They couldn't understand why I chose to spend weekends learning to treat gunshot wounds and traumatic amputations when I could be studying for upcoming exams or enjoying what little free time medical school allowed. "Don't you want a normal life?" asked Jennifer, a classmate from Connecticut, whose father was a prominent cardiologist. We were studying together in the library, surrounded by towers of immunology textbooks. "I don't think I know what normal means," I said honestly. "This feels normal to me." She looked at me with the kind of curiosity reserved for exotic animals. "But don't you want to get married? Have kids? Buy a house with a white picket fence?" The questions felt like they belonged to someone else's life. "Maybe someday. But first, I want to become the kind of doctor who can save lives in impossible situations." Third-year rotations began with internal medicine at Cleveland Clinic. My first real patients, real diagnoses, real consequences for mistakes. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, was a no-nonsense woman who'd built her reputation on being tough, but fair. "Military scholarship?" she asked, reviewing my file during our first meeting. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Means you understand discipline and hierarchy. Half these students think medical school is democracy, where everyone gets to voice their opinion. This isn't democracy, Chen. This is life and death." She was right. Medicine was more like the military than anyone wanted to admit. Clear chain of command, life or death decisions made under pressure, and the absolute necessity of trusting your team. My military training translated perfectly to hospital hierarchies and emergency situations. During my surgery rotation, I met Dr. Robert Hawkins, the head of trauma surgery and a former Navy surgeon. He was performing an emergency appendectomy when I first scrubbed in, his hands moving with the kind of precision that only came from years of practice under pressure. "Military?" he asked without looking up from the patient. "Army Reserve. Combat medic training." "Show me your suturing." He handed me the needle holder, watching carefully as I closed the incision with small, even stitches. My hands didn't shake, despite this being my first time suturing on a real person rather than practice pads. "Not bad," he said, which I'd learned was high praise from surgeons. "You planning to specialize in trauma?" "That's the goal, sir." "Good. We need more surgeons who understand what happens before patients get to us." My fourth year brought news that changed everything. The Army was expanding its trauma surgery program and looking for candidates who combined medical training with combat experience. The opportunity meant an additional 2 years of military service after residency, but it also meant training at some of the most advanced trauma centers in the world. I applied without hesitation. The interview was conducted by a panel of military medical officers at Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington. Colonel Peterson, a trauma surgeon who'd served multiple deployments, led the questioning. "Why trauma surgery, Dr. Chen?" she asked, using the title that still felt foreign on my ears. "Because that's where medicine matters most," I said. "When someone's life hangs in the balance and you have minutes to save them, everything else feels like luxury in comparison." "And you're prepared for deployment? For treating wounded soldiers in active combat zones?" I thought about all the abandoned children who'd learned to survive without guarantees, all the midnight study sessions in empty libraries, all the field exercises where I'd learned to make impossible decisions under pressure. "I've been preparing for that my entire life," I said. The acceptance letter arrived 3 weeks later. I was invited to join the Army's elite trauma surgery program, with training at Johns Hopkins, and eventual deployment to forward operating bases where advanced surgical care could mean the difference between soldiers coming home alive or in body. "Bags," Mrs. Rodriguez cried when I called to tell her the news. Danny, now a captain stationed at Fort Bragg, said he wasn't surprised but was proud anyway. "You're going to save a lot of lives," he said. "That's the plan." But neither of us could have predicted that the most important life I'd end up saving would be my own understanding of where I came from and who I really was. Residency at Johns Hopkins was a special kind of controlled chaos that made medical school look like kindergarten. 18-hour shifts blended into each other, sleep became a luxury measured in minutes rather than hours, and the trauma bay became my second home. Dr. Amanda Foster, the chief of trauma surgery, was a legend who'd trained half the military, surgeons currently deployed overseas. "Chen," she said during my first week, "you're here because someone thinks you can handle the pressure. Don't make them look stupid." The trauma cases came in waves. Car accidents, shootings, industrial mishaps, domestic violence injuries that made my stomach clench with familiar anger. Each patient was a puzzle to solve under time pressure, with lives hanging in the balance of every decision. My military background set me apart from the other residents. While they struggled with the hierarchy and pressure, I thrived in the structured chaos. When Dr. Foster barked orders during a complex procedure, I responded with the same precision I'd learned during combat training. "You don't panic," observed Dr. James Liu, a fellow resident from California whose hands shook during his first month in trauma. "How do you stay so calm?" "Panic is a luxury I learned I couldn't afford," I said, prepping for my next surgery. When everything in your life has been uncertain, medical emergencies feel almost normal. My reputation grew quickly, the kind of surgeon who could work 30 hours straight without losing focus, who could make split-second decisions in impossible situations, who treated every patient like their life was the only thing that mattered in the world. 6 months into residency, I received orders for my first deployment. Afghanistan, forward operating base outside Kandahar. Trauma surgery for wounded soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire of a war that had been going on longer than I'd been alive. The goodbye dinner was small. Mrs. Rodriguez flew in from Ohio, her hair grayer now, but her hug just as warm. Danny came up from North Carolina wearing dress blues and the kind of pride that made my chest tight with emotion. "Scared?" he asked as we sat in a quiet restaurant near the hospital. "Terrified," I admitted, but also excited. "This is what I've been training for." Mrs. Rodriguez reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Wendell would be so proud. He always said you were meant for important things." The flight to Afghanistan took 26 hours with stops in Germany and Qatar. I spent most of the time reviewing trauma protocols and trying not to think about the fact that I was voluntarily flying toward a war zone. The other medical personnel on the transport were a mix of seasoned veterans on their 3rd or 4th deployment, and first-timers like me who alternated between excitement and terror. Forward operating base. Chapman was a collection of prefabricated buildings and tents surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. The landscape was brown and harsh, mountains in the distance that looked like they'd been carved by an angry god. The air smelled like dust and diesel fuel and something indefinable that I later learned was the scent of a place where violence lived alongside routine. Major Sarah Washington, the chief medical officer, met me at the landing zone. She was a compact woman with graying temples and the kind of steady presence that came from seeing everything multiple times. "Welcome to paradise, Chen," she said with dry humor. "Hope you're ready to work, because we're short-staffed and the Taliban didn't get the memo about your arrival schedule." The field hospital was more sophisticated than I'd expected, but more primitive than anything I'd worked in before. 2 operating rooms, a triage area, recovery beds for patients stable enough to transport, and a small morgue that I tried not to think about too much. My first case came 6 hours after I arrived. IED explosion, 3 wounded soldiers, 1 civilian contractor. The most serious case was a 20-year-old private from Texas whose leg had been nearly severed by shrapnel. As I worked to save the limb, he kept asking if he'd be able to walk his daughter down the aisle someday. "You focus on staying alive," I told him while cleaning the wound. "Let me worry about the walking." The surgery took 4 hours. Complex, vascular repair, bone reconstruction, soft tissue grafting. When he woke up in recovery with his leg still attached, he cried tears that had nothing to do with pain. The pace was relentless. Casualties came in waves that corresponded to the rhythm of combat operations. Quiet days when we caught up on paperwork and maintenance, followed by periods when the helicopters landed one after another, carrying broken bodies that needed immediate attention. I learned to sleep through mortar attacks and wake instantly when the casualty alarm sounded. I learned to eat while walking between patients and to make life or death decisions with incomplete information. I learned that saving someone's life was the most addictive feeling in the world. 3 months into my deployment, we received a group of casualties from a complex attack on a village patrol. 6 soldiers, 2 interpreters, and a group of Afghan civilians caught in the crossfire. The worst case was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with severe abdominal trauma from an improvised explosive device. As I worked to repair her injuries, she reminded me of myself at that age. Not physically, but something in her eyes, the way she looked at the adults around her with a mixture of trust and wariness, the way she accepted pain like it was just another thing that happened to children who had no control over their circumstances. "She's going to make it," Major Washington said as we finished the surgery. "Thanks to you." That night, I sat outside, the medical tent looking at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than any I'd seen before. The little girl was stable, the soldiers would recover, and tomorrow would bring new cases that would test everything I'd learned about medicine and myself. For the first time since my parents had abandoned me, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Not because it was safe or comfortable, but because it was where my skills mattered most, where the person I'd been forced to become could save lives that might otherwise be lost. I was serving something larger than myself, something that had nothing to do with the family that had thrown me away, and everything to do with the family I'd chosen to protect. The deployment was supposed to last 12 months, but I extended it for another 6. The work was too important. The team too much. Like family and civilian life felt increasingly foreign compared to the clarity of mission I'd found in Afghanistan. When I finally returned to the States, everything seemed strangely quiet and complicated. Johns Hopkins welcomed me back with a promotion to chief resident and an offer to stay on as faculty after completing my residency. The hospital had changed. While I was gone, new equipment and procedures. But the rhythm of trauma surgery felt like coming home. My deployment experience had sharpened my skills in ways that impressed even Dr. Foster. "You're different," she observed during my first week. "Back, more decisive, more confident." "I learned to trust my instincts," I said, reviewing the chart for an incoming gunshot wound. "When you don't have time for second-guessing, you get good at being right the first time." The cases that had once seemed overwhelming now felt manageable. Car accidents and domestic violence injuries were serious but straightforward compared to battlefield trauma, where you operated while mortars fell outside the tent. My success rate improved, my surgical times decreased, and my reputation as someone who could handle impossible cases grew throughout the hospital. I bought my first house that spring, a small bungalow in a quiet neighborhood near the hospital. 3 bedrooms, a garden I didn't know how to tend, and a mortgage that represented the first truly permanent thing I'd ever owned. Mrs. Rodriguez flew out for the housewarming party, walking through each room like she was blessing it with her presence. "Look at you," she said, standing in my kitchen with tears in her eyes. "A real home." "It's strange," I admitted. "I keep expecting someone to tell me I have to leave. That's not going to happen anymore, sweetheart. This is yours." The word "yours" still felt foreign, but I was learning to believe it. My social life expanded slowly. Other residents invited me to dinner parties and weekend trips. Relationships. That felt easier now that I wasn't constantly waiting for abandonment. I even started dating again. Nothing serious, but pleasant dinners with other doctors who understood the demands of the profession. 2 years after returning from Afghanistan, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was professional but warm, introducing herself as Patricia Williams from the law firm of Henderson, Brooks and Associates in Cleveland. "Dr. Chen, I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Eleanor Blackwell. You may not be familiar with the name, but according to our records, you may have a connection to the deceased." My hands went cold. "I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong person. I don't know anyone named Blackwell." The records indicate you were born Maya Elizabeth Blackwell on March 15, 1987 in Cleveland, Ohio. Is that correct? The room seemed to tilt. I'd been born Maya Chen according to my adoption papers, but Elizabeth had been my middle name on some early documents that my parents had later changed. How did you get that information? Mrs. Blackwell left specific instructions for locating you. She passed away 3 months ago, and her will contains provisions that may be of significant interest to you. Would it be possible to schedule a meeting? I made the appointment for the following Thursday, my mind racing with questions I couldn't begin to answer. Margaret Eleanor Blackwell. The name meant nothing to me, but somehow she'd known enough about my birth to find me decades later. The law offices of Henderson, Brooks & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Cleveland. Patricia Williams was an elegant woman in her 50s who led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Erie. Before we begin, she said, opening a thick file, I want to prepare you for some potentially shocking information. Mrs. Blackwell was very specific about how this should be handled. She slid a photograph across the table. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, sitting in what looked like a library surrounded by books and papers. She looked vaguely familiar in the way that strangers sometimes do, but I couldn't place her. Mrs. Blackwell was Margaret Blackwell, founder and CEO of Blackwell Industries. Perhaps you've heard of the company? I had. Blackwell Industries was a massive conglomerate involved in everything from aerospace to renewable energy, one of the largest privately held companies in the Midwest, worth billions according to business magazines. She died at age 78 with no immediate family, Patricia continued, but she spent considerable resources over the years trying to locate someone she referred to as my granddaughter who was stolen from me. The air left my lungs. Granddaughter? According to the documentation Mrs. Blackwell compiled, her daughter, Sarah, gave birth to a child in 1987. Sarah died shortly after childbirth from complications, and the baby disappeared from the hospital before Mrs. Blackwell could take custody. She believed the child had been illegally adopted through a network that specialized in placing babies with families who could pay significant fees. My vision blurred around the edges. You're saying I was kidnapped? Not kidnapped exactly, but likely adopted through channels that weren't entirely legal. Mrs. Blackwell hired private investigators for over 30 years trying to find you. She finally succeeded 6 months before her death. Patricia opened another folder and pulled out copies of hospital records, birth certificates, and what looked like surveillance photos of me walking into Johns Hopkins. The documentation was overwhelming, meticulous, undeniable. She knew about your military service, your medical career, everything. She was incredibly proud of what you'd accomplished despite the circumstances of your childhood. Why didn't she contact me while she was alive? She wanted to, but her lawyers advised against it. You'd built a successful life, and she was concerned that sudden contact might be disruptive. She decided to let you continue your path and leave you information after her death. Patricia handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in elegant handwriting. She wrote this for you. Inside was a letter that began simply, My dearest Maya, if you're reading this, then I've finally found you, and you're learning the truth about where you came from. The letter was 3 pages long, written in the careful script of someone who'd chosen every word precisely. She described losing her daughter, the desperate search for her granddaughter, the private investigators, and false leads and years of hoping. I don't know what your childhood was like, she wrote, but I hope you know that you were wanted, you were loved, and everything I built was always meant to be yours. At the bottom of the letter was a phone number and an address. When you're ready to learn more, these people will help you understand what this means. Patricia was watching me carefully when I finished reading. There's more, Dr. Chen, quite a bit more. Mrs. Blackwell left you her entire estate, houses, investments, the controlling interest in Blackwell Industries. You're now worth approximately $2.3 billion. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. That's not possible. It's very possible. And there's something else. The people who adopted you illegally? Mrs. Blackwell's investigators found them too. The revelation that the Chens weren't my real parents should have felt liberating, but instead it felt like another betrayal layered on top of the original abandonment. Patricia Williams handed me a thick folder containing everything Margaret Blackwell's investigators had discovered about my adoption and the people who'd raised me for 15 years. The Chens paid $40,000 for you through an illegal adoption ring operating out of Detroit, Patricia explained, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. The ring specialized in taking babies from hospitals before proper legal procedures could be completed. Your grandmother's money and grief made you a target. I stared at the documents spread across the conference table. Bank records showing the payment, forged birth certificates, testimonials from other families who'd been victimized by the same operation. The evidence was overwhelming and nauseating. They bought me, I said, the words tasting bitter. And when money got tight, they discarded you. Mrs. Blackwell's investigators tracked them to a suburb outside Detroit. They're still living there, apparently comfortable despite their financial troubles from years ago. The address felt like a weapon in my hands. 1247 Maple Street, Dearborn, Michigan. Robert and Linda Chen, ages 56 and 54 respectively. Still married, still living the quiet suburban life they'd carved out with money earned by trafficking stolen children. What do you want to do with this information? Patricia asked. I folded the papers carefully and slipped them into my purse. I need time to think. The drive back to Baltimore took 4 hours, but I barely remembered any of it. My mind kept circling around the same impossible facts. I was a billionaire. My real grandmother had spent 30 years looking for me. The people I'd called parents had literally purchased me and then thrown me away when I became inconvenient. That evening, I sat in my small house surrounded by the modest life I'd built through scholarship and sacrifice, trying to reconcile it with the vast inheritance that was apparently mine. The paperwork Patricia had given me included contact information for Margaret Blackwell's personal staff, people who were waiting to help me transition into a life I'd never imagined. I called Mrs. Rodriguez first, because she was the closest thing to family I had, and I needed to hear a familiar voice. Maya, honey, you sound strange. Everything okay? I need to tell you something incredible, and I need you to sit down first. I explained everything slowly, watching her reactions through the video call. Her eyes grew wider with each revelation, but she didn't interrupt until I finished. Sweet Jesus, she whispered. You're rich, apparently. And those people who raised you, they stole you? Bought me. From people who stole me. She was quiet. For a long moment, processing information that seemed to belong in a movie rather than real life. What are you going to do? I don't know. Part of me wants to pretend none of this happened and keep living my life. The other part wants to burn down their world the way they burned down mine. What would Margaret want you to do? I looked at the letter again, reading her words about hope and love and the legacy she'd tried to preserve for me. She'd want me to be happy, to use what she built for good. Then maybe that's your answer. The next morning, I called Patricia Williams and scheduled a meeting with Margaret Blackwell's estate manager. If I was going to inherit billions of dollars, I needed to understand what that actually meant and what responsibilities came with it. James Morrison was a distinguished man in his 60s who'd managed the Blackwell family finances for over 20 years. He met me at the estate's main office in Cleveland, a building I now apparently owned along with everything else Margaret had accumulated. Mrs. Blackwell was very specific about her wishes, he explained, showing me through portfolios and investment statements that made my head spin. She wanted the company to continue its work in renewable energy and medical research. She also wanted to establish a foundation focused on finding missing children and supporting adoption reform. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman whose Granddaughter had been stolen, wanted to help other families avoid the same tragedy. She left detailed plans for everything, James continued. You don't have to make any major decisions immediately. The company essentially runs itself, and there are boards and managers for everything. Your role would be primarily strategic oversight. What about the foundation? That was her passion project. She'd already allocated $50 million for startup costs and had begun working with organizations that specialize in reuniting families. I thought about all the kids I'd known at Sunrise Group Home, the ones whose families had genuinely disappeared, rather than simply choosing to abandon them. The resources to help find missing children felt like exactly the kind of purpose Margaret would have wanted her money to serve. I want to move forward with the foundation, I said, and I want to make some changes to how we approach adoption oversight. James smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him. Mrs. Blackwell said you'd probably say something like that. She thought you'd understand what needed to be done. Over the next week, I met with lawyers, accountants, and board members who walked me through the complexities of inheriting a business empire. The money was overwhelming, but the responsibility felt familiar. Another mission to accomplish, another group of people counting on me to make the right decisions. I also spent time researching Robert and Linda Chen. Margaret's investigators had been thorough. Current address, employment history, financial, records showing they'd struggled with money for years after abandoning me. They'd never had other children, never adopted again, apparently content to live quietly with their secret. But secrets had a way of demanding attention, especially when the person they'd wronged suddenly had unlimited resources and a very specific understanding of justice. I made my decision on a Friday evening, sitting in Margaret's study in the Cleveland mansion that was now mine. Surrounded by her books and papers, looking at photographs of the daughter she'd lost and the granddaughter she'd spent decades trying to find, I picked up the phone and called Patricia Williams. I want to press charges, I said. Against the Chens and anyone else involved in the adoption ring who's still alive? That might be difficult after all these years. Then I want to make it public. I want everyone to know what they did. And I want to make sure it never happens to another child. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Are you sure? This will change everything. Your privacy, your ability to live quietly. I looked at Margaret's photograph on the desk. This woman who'd never stopped fighting for families she'd never gotten to meet. I've never lived quietly, I said. And I'm tired of protecting people who don't deserve protection. The press conference was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the Cleveland offices of Henderson Brooks and Associates. I'd spent 3 days working with Patricia Williams and a public relations firm to craft a statement that would maximize impact while maintaining legal precision. The story was too explosive to release quietly, but it needed to be handled carefully to ensure the focus remained on justice rather than sensationalism. Major news outlets had been given advance notice that Dr. Maya Chen, newly revealed heir to the Blackwell fortune, would be making a statement about illegal adoption practices and her own stolen childhood. The conference room filled with reporters, cameras, and the kind of energy that preceded big revelations. I wore a navy suit that Margaret had left in her closet, tailored perfectly as if she'd known I'd eventually need it. Around my neck was the compass necklace Mrs. Rodriguez had given me at graduation, now feeling more symbolic than ever. Good morning, I began, looking directly into the cameras. My name is Dr. Maya Chen, though I recently learned that my birth name was Maya Elizabeth Blackwell. 3 weeks ago, I discovered that I am the granddaughter of Margaret Blackwell, founder of Blackwell Industries, and that I was illegally adopted as an infant through a criminal network that specialized in stealing children from hospitals. Chakrapur. Room erupted with questions, but I held up my hand for silence. The people who purchased me, Robert and Linda Chen of Dearborn, Michigan, raised me until I was 15 years old. When their financial situation became difficult, they abandoned me at a group home, telling me it was temporary. They never returned. I lived in state care until I aged out of the system, put myself through college and medical school, and served as a combat surgeon in Afghanistan. I paused, letting the weight of the story settle over the room. Yesterday, through my grandmother's estate, I filed criminal charges against the Chens and a civil lawsuit seeking damages not just for myself, but for every child who was victimized by this adoption ring. I'm also announcing the creation of the Margaret Blackwell Foundation for Missing Children, which will work to reunite stolen children with their families and reform adoption oversight to prevent future trafficking. The questions came in a flood. How long had I known about my real identity? What was it like discovering I was a billionaire? What did I want to say to the people who'd abandoned me? I want to be clear about something, I said, addressing the last question directly. The Chens didn't just abandon me when times got tough. They purchased me illegally, forged documents to hide my true identity, and then discarded me when I became inconvenient. This wasn't a family struggling with poverty. This was a criminal enterprise that treated children as commodities. After the press conference, I drove to Dearborn. The address Margaret's investigators had provided led to a modest ranch house, with a small front yard and an aging Honda in the driveway. The same car they'd used to drive me to Sunrise Group home 8 years earlier. I sat in my rental car across the street for 20 minutes, watching the house where two people who'd stolen my childhood were probably watching the news coverage of their exposure. Part of me wanted to knock on their door, to see their faces when they realized the child they'd thrown away had grown up to become someone with enough power to destroy them. Instead, I called Detective Sarah Martinez of the Dearborn Police Department, who'd been briefed on the case by federal investigators. Dr. Chen, we've been expecting your call. Are you in the area? I'm parked outside their house. Don't approach them. We have units en route to make the arrests. The federal task force wants to coordinate this carefully since it ties into a larger investigation. I watched from my car as 3 police cars arrived 15 minutes later. The Chen's front door opened before the officers could knock, as if they'd been watching too. Robert Chen looked older and grayer than I remembered, his shoulders slumped with defeat. Linda followed behind him, her face hard and angry rather than remorseful. They were handcuffed without drama, loaded into separate police cars, and driven away from the house where they'd lived quietly for years while I struggled to build a life from nothing. The whole arrest took less than 10 minutes. My phone rang as the police cars disappeared around the corner. Maya? Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was tight with emotion. I just saw the news. Are you okay? I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. I'm free. Where are you? Standing outside the house where they lived while I was sleeping in group homes and working. 3 jobs to pay for college. Looking at the life they built with money they got for selling me. What are you feeling? I considered the question, taking inventory of emotions that should have been clearer. Not what I expected. I thought I'd feel angry or vindicated, but mostly I just feel empty. Like this was something I had to do, but not something that changes who I am. Maybe that's because you already won, sweetheart. You became someone amazing despite what they did to you. The arrest is just paperwork. That evening, I returned to Cleveland and met with James Morrison to discuss the foundation. Margaret had left detailed plans, but I wanted to expand the scope beyond what she'd originally envisioned. I want to create a fast response team, I explained, spreading my ideas across his conference table. When a child goes missing, we mobilize immediately with private investigators, technology resources, and financial support for the families. No waiting for police departments to prioritize cases, no bureaucratic delays. That's ambitious. Also expensive. We have unlimited resources. Money isn't the constraint, time is. Every day a child is missing makes recovery less likely. James nodded approvingly. Mrs. Blackwell would be proud. She always said you'd understand what needed to be done because you'd lived it. I also want to create scholarships for kids aging out of foster care. Full rides to college, graduate school, whatever they need to build independent lives. Like what you did for yourself. Like what I wish someone had done for me. The foundation's first case came 2 weeks later. A 3-year-old girl had disappeared from a shopping mall in Ohio, and local police suspected she'd been taken by someone involved in illegal adoption networks. Our team of investigators, technology specialists, and former law enforcement officers mobilized within 6 hours. We found her in 48 hours, safe but scared, with a couple who'd paid $20,000 to a broker they'd met online. The reunion with her parents was everything I'd dreamed my own reunion might have been, if anyone had been looking for me. Standing in that hospital room, watching a mother hold her recovered daughter, I realized that Margaret had given me something more valuable than money. She'd given me purpose that transformed old pain into new hope for other families. The Chens pled guilty to federal charges related to illegal adoption and child trafficking. They received prison sentences and were ordered to pay restitution that would fund the foundation's work for years to come. Justice felt quieter than I'd expected, but more complete than revenge ever could have been. The trial of the larger adoption ring took 18 months to work through the federal court system. I testified for 3 days, walking a packed courtroom through the details of my stolen childhood and the decades of searching that followed. The defendants included the hospital administrator who'd facilitated my disappearance, the broker who'd connected buyers with stolen children, and 7 other adoptive parents who'd knowingly purchased babies through illegal channels. Each day, in court, felt like performing surgery on my own past, cutting away infected tissue to reveal healthy truth underneath. The defense attorneys tried to paint the adoptive parents as victims who'd simply wanted children and hadn't asked too many questions about the process. But federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh had done her homework, presenting bank records and recorded conversations that proved the buyers knew exactly what they were purchasing. "Dr. Chen," Walsh said during my final day of testimony, "what would you say to other victims of illegal adoption who might be afraid to come forward?" I looked directly at the cameras that had been permitted in the courtroom, knowing this moment would be broadcast across the country. I'd tell them that silence protects the people who hurt you, and speaking up protects the children who might be hurt next. You don't have to be perfect or healed or ready. You just have to be honest about what happened. The verdicts came on a Friday afternoon in March. Guilty on all counts for 15 defendants, with sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years in federal prison. The courtroom erupted with applause from families who'd been victimized by the same network, people who'd traveled from across the country to witness justice being served. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me with questions about how it felt to see my kidnappers convicted. But the question that stayed with me came from a young woman about my age who approached after the media dispersed. "Dr. Chen, I'm adopted too, and I've always wondered about my birth family. How do I know if my adoption was legal?" I gave her the foundation's contact information and watched her walk away, wondering how many other people were living with similar questions. That night, I announced that the Margaret Blackwell Foundation would expand its services to include helping adopted individuals research their origins and connect with birth families when appropriate. The foundation's success exceeded even Margaret's ambitious projections. In our first 2 years, we reunited 47 missing children with their families and helped investigate over 200 suspicious adoption cases. The scholarship program supported 300 kids aging out of foster care, giving them the educational opportunities I'd fought so hard to earn for myself. But the work that mattered most to me was the quiet cases that never made headlines. Teenagers who'd aged out of group homes and needed mentorship. Single mothers whose children had been taken by partners threatening to disappear. Families who couldn't afford private investigators, but refused to give up hope. Each success felt personal, like saving a version of myself that existed in every abandoned child who'd learned to survive without guarantees. My medical career continued alongside the foundation work. I'd been promoted to attending surgeon at Johns Hopkins and was training the next generation of trauma doctors. Many of my residents were military veterans or people from difficult backgrounds who understood that medicine was more than a profession. It was a calling to serve people in their most vulnerable moments. Dr. Foster retired that spring and asked me to consider taking over as chief of trauma surgery. The offer represented everything I'd worked toward professionally, but it would mean stepping back from the foundation's day-to-day operations. "What would Margaret want you to do?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked during one of our weekly phone calls. "She'd want me to choose based on where I could do the most good." "And where is that?" I thought about the children we'd rescued, the families we'd reunited, the reforms we'd pushed through state legislatures to make illegal adoption more difficult. Then I thought about the soldiers whose lives I'd saved in Afghanistan and the patients who trusted me with their most critical moments. "Both," I said finally. "I want to do both." The solution came from an unexpected source. Johns Hopkins offered to create a partnership between the hospital and the foundation, allowing me to maintain my surgical practice while expanding our medical services for rescued children who needed specialized trauma care. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking Margaret would have appreciated, turning personal pain into institutional change that could help thousands of people. 5 years after learning my true identity, I stood in the main conference room of Blackwell Industries for our annual board meeting. The company had grown under my leadership, expanding our renewable energy initiatives and launching new medical research divisions focused on trauma care innovations I'd helped design based on battlefield experience. But the moment that defined everything came during the meeting's final agenda item. James Morrison stood and announced that we'd received a letter addressed to me personally, from someone claiming to have information about other children stolen by the same adoption ring that had taken me. The letter was from Linda Chen. She was writing from federal prison, where she was serving a 12-year sentence for her role in the trafficking network. Her handwriting was shaky, aged by incarceration, and what I hoped was genuine remorse. "Dr. Chen," the letter began, "I know I have no right to contact you, but there are things you need to know about other children who were taken the same way. You were. I've been thinking about this for 3 years, and I can't die with these secrets." She provided names, dates, hospitals where other babies had been stolen between 1985 and 1990, a detailed accounting of crimes that extended far beyond my own case, information that could help reunite dozens of families who'd been separated for decades. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote in closing, "but maybe this information can help repair some of the damage we caused." I read the letter twice before calling Patricia Williams and Detective Martinez. Within a week, federal investigators had opened 17 new cases based on Linda Chen's information. The Margaret Blackwell Foundation coordinated with law enforcement to begin the careful process of reaching out to families who'd lost children 35 years earlier. The first successful reunion happened 2 months later. David Kim, a software engineer from Seattle, discovered that he'd been stolen as an infant from a hospital in Los Angeles. His birth parents, who'd never stopped searching, were Korean immigrants who'd spent their life savings on private investigators and reward postings that led nowhere. I flew to Seattle to witness their reunion at the airport. Watching them embrace, for the first time since David was 3 days old, I finally understood what Margaret had been searching for all those years. Not just me, but the completion of a family that had been artificially broken. "How do you thank someone for giving you back your child?" David's mother asked me through tears, speaking in accented English that reminded me of the interpreters I'd worked with in Afghanistan. "You don't thank me," I said, holding her hands while her son stood beside her. 40 years old, but looking like a lost boy who'd finally found his way home. "You live fully and love deeply, and remember that family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing to fight for each other." That evening, I called Mrs. Rodriguez from my hotel room overlooking Elliott Bay. "Another family back together," I told her. "How many does that make?" 49 families reunited, 63 children found and returned safely. 215 kids helped through the scholarship program. The numbers had become a mantra, proof that Margaret's money was being transformed into something that mattered. What's next for you, sweetheart? I looked out at the water, thinking about the little girl I'd been who was abandoned at 15, the medical student who'd joined the military to pay for school, the surgeon who'd saved lives in a war zone, and the woman who'd inherited billions only to discover that her real inheritance was the responsibility to help others. I'm thinking about adopting, I said, surprising myself with the words. There are so many kids aging out of foster care who just need someone to believe in them. Like you needed. Like I found, eventually. Mrs. Rodriguez, Danny, the military, even Margaret in her own way. I want to be that person for someone else. You already are, Maya, for hundreds of kids you've helped, but I think you'd make a wonderful mother. The conversation ended with plans for her to visit the following month. I sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me from abandonment to abundance, from stolen child to someone who could steal children back from the people who'd taken them. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's building something beautiful from the pieces of what was broken, creating family where none existed before, and proving that love chosen is stronger than love lost. The little girl who'd waited for parents who never came back had grown into a woman who made sure other children wouldn't have to wait alone. 2 years later, I adopted Sofia, a 16-year-old who'd aged out of foster care in Cleveland. She reminded me of myself at that age, brilliant, guarded, and convinced that depending on anyone was a luxury she couldn't afford. On her first night in the mansion Margaret had left me, she stood in the doorway of her new bedroom looking overwhelmed. "This doesn't feel real," she whispered. "It didn't feel real to me either at first," I said, remembering my own disbelief at inheriting billions. But sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never saw coming. 6 months after Sofia moved in, we received news that changed everything again. Linda Chen had died in prison, but not before providing one final piece of information that broke open the largest child trafficking case in FBI history. Her deathbed confession led to the rescue of over 300 children and the prosecution of a network that had operated for 40 years. At the press conference announcing the arrests, Sofia stood beside me as I addressed the cameras. She'd insisted on being there, saying she wanted other foster kids to see that their stories could have happy endings too. Every child deserves to know where they came from and to have someone fight for their future, I said, my arm around the daughter I'd chosen and who'd chosen me back. That evening, Sofia and I sat in Margaret's old study, now our study, working on college applications. She wanted to become a social worker, to help kids like us who'd learned to save themselves. "Do you think your grandmother would be proud?" she asked. I looked at Margaret's portrait on the wall, the woman who'd never stopped searching for family she'd never met. I think she'd say we turned out exactly the way we were supposed to. If this story inspired you to believe that your past doesn't define your future, hit that subscribe button and share your own story of resilience in the comments below.